Hello and welcome to Lab 10, Plate Tectonics. This video is being provided for you as additional support to provide help, tips, tricks, and other ways to complete this lab efficiently and effectively. I find that this is quite helpful for those taking online classes and for those that need to review the context within the labs, as it provides step-by-step instructions by page steps. Now we can see here that the learning objectives for this lab are to distinguish between oceanic and continental tectonic plates. You'll also be able to diagram a cross-section of the Earth. You'll learn to identify the three types of plate tectonic boundaries, explain how oceanic hotspots create chains of volcanic islands, compare hotspots to plate tectonic plate boundaries, identify geographic examples of different plate tectonic boundaries and hotspots, and lastly, explain why plate tectonic theory itself is the unifying theory of all geology. So essentially, this lab is really going to dive into not just the theory, but the functionality of plate tectonics, how it works, why it works, and then looking at the resulting landscape that's created because of that. Well, that being said, let's move on to Part A. Welcome to Part A, Tectonic Plates. So this portion of the lab is really going to teach us about what tectonic plates are, some of the geologic history and past that can be observed and interpreted through those motions, as well as looking at some of the supercontinents that had once existed, such as Pangaea. Now, as I move on to the next page, we can see that there is a diagram, figure 13.1, which is a simplified map of Earth's plates and their corresponding tectonic boundaries. This is just a simplified image. So these are much larger plates. There are smaller ones that are mixed throughout, but this is just kind of the dominant pieces. And what's important to learn is that we will find that most of these plates will either fall under one or the other category, being continental or oceanic. And what's important to know about that is that whether it's continental or oceanic really defines what it's made of. Traditionally, continental plates are made out of granite. Oceanic plates are made out of basalt, which is darker and denser in its material. We also have below here a traditional projection of the world map, in which we're going to be using these later. But again, it's first having you just look at these two maps. The tectonic map, you can see that each plate itself has been outlined in a color. We also see little arrows that are showing the direction in which they're moving, which will establish what that means a little bit further on. So question 1 says, now refer to figure 13.1 and answer the following questions, such as, what are the names of the large continental plates that surround the Pacific Ocean? Part B, what are the names of the smaller oceanic plates that surround the Pacific Ocean plate itself? And then along the California coast, do the arrows show that the oceanic Pacific plate is converging, or is it sliding past? And the last part here is, what is the name of the oceanic plate that is found between the oceanic Pacific plate and the continental South American plate? So really the purpose of question 1 is to have you evaluate that map and look at those arrows, look at the direction which things are moving, and also to kind of paint a picture as to whether it is oceanic or continental in which those areas lie. That being said, we wrap up Part A. Now, Part B is called Earth's Interior. So now what we're looking at is from above, what's underneath. So it says here, in order to understand the movement of tectonic plates, we need to take a look at the Earth's interior. Figure 13.3 is a cross-section of the Earth. Note, it's not to scale, but we're able to observe all of these different layers. Something that I want to point out is that we know that these layers exist. Note that they say whether they're a solid or a liquid. There's special names and depths that correlate to each one. The way that I like to think about this is like a homemade salad dressing. And you find that the salad dressing, as it sits for a long time, begins to separate. And it's separating based off of its density. But we also know that separation can occur not just with density, but also because of temperatures. And so it's kind of in that sense that we see these separating layers is based on the material content as well as the temperatures involved. So continue reading through this. It says, at the center of the Earth is a dense metallic core. The inner core is solid, while the outer core is liquid. Heat from the inner core causes the outer core to convect, called a convection transfer, the heating of heat rising and then sinking. That heat comes from the radioactive decay of isotopes in the center of the Earth. So as you continue to work through these definitions, it really paints the picture of the difference between all of these layers, and then you can see that we then wrap up at the top looking at our lithosphere, which is a mixture of our oceanic and continental crust themselves. So it continues to read through, giving you some additional insight on what they are made of, the density, the location, which then brings us to question 2, which says to sketch and label a cross-section of the Earth similar to that shown in figure 13.3. Include the following components: solid inner core, liquid outer core, lower mantle, upper mantle, so on and so forth. So it's asking you to essentially recreate the diagram on the previous page, but to identify specific things. This will become very helpful when studying for your exams when you need to learn about the different layers. Just like we did with learning the different layers of our atmosphere, now we can look at the different layers of our Earth. And that will also answer some questions later on. The bottom part here then describes the MOHO boundary, where it was named from, how it operates, and why it's important. It's essentially bringing in that idea as to what prevents us from melting. For those of us that live on the crust, right? What is that boundary that protects us? And that's what really brings you into that concept. So question 3 says, use a highlighter and trace where the MOHO is on your diagram that you sketched on the question above. Then moving forward, we can see to help us understand how movement in the asthenosphere can cause tectonic plate movements, let's look at a model of convection cells. So this is a simplified diagram showing, again, the outer core, mantle, asthenosphere, and lithosphere, and we can denote the arrows and their motion. And because of that moving and that motion, things on top are fed and that energy is transferred, which can create that motion. And in doing so, a couple different things happen. We end up creating an area like a ridge. I may back up a little bit. When I think of how the lithosphere then moves, these are the gears and motions that provide that energy, and this is the escalator, as it were, as it's being forced along. So you'll have a spot, a ridge, where it actually separates and pulls apart, which is the creation of new, and then as it moves farther and farther away, it gets older with time, but at some point it will probably become a trench, or will subduct and get pulled down, and then just the heat alone will continue to pull it. Just like this, that idea of an escalator at the mall, that you have an area where it's pushing out, an area that's pulling down, and it creates a cycle that is in constant motion. So question 4 and 5 ask you to evaluate that diagram and those motions, and what do you think about that and how it works. It's, again, bringing in those observations and interpretations. The next part down here is a check it out. So you scan that with your cell phone or click that URL code, and it says watch the video called Layers of the Earth. What are they? How are they formed? And so it's a very short video, about 6 minutes, that kind of teaches you more about our plate layers themselves and how they're in motion, what feeds them and drives those motions. Moving forward, we get to a second model, which is very similar, but this one is called a double layer model, or the layer cake model, which provides a 2-layer convection. So again, similar in its operation, but we're seeing multiple layers of this convection occurring that's split between the lower and the upper mantle. So now we get a bigger picture of it, because before, when we were looking at it, it was just simplified. Now we're looking at things a little more complex. And question 6 is asking you to use your critical thinking skills and answer some questions regarding that diagram. What do you think about the motion? Why do you think that there are two, trains of thought? Which one do you think is more effective? Which one do you think makes more sense? And things like that. So you'll read through the context, evaluate and observe that image, and then create your identification, create your not just your observation, but your interpretation of how that operates and works, and use some of the skills that you've learned so far in this lab. That being said, we wrapped up Part B. Now, Part C is called Tectonic plate boundaries. So in this portion of the lab, we're going to learn, before, Part B, we learned about the directions that things were moving, and we were able to learn to observe and interpret that, but now we're going to associate names with the directions, and we're going to be able to associate names with major plate boundaries that have become very near and dear to us Earth scientists. So as you work through this, it explains the differences between convergent, divergent, and transform boundaries. And then what we're going to do is we're going to use an application to look at the cracked plates Earth science inquiry, essentially. So what you're going to do is either take a picture of the QR code or click the URL, and it's going to take you to an interactive map in which you're going to be able to work through, in specific, California, to look at what boundaries we're dealing with, what type of drawings are being presented. As an example, they present in the legend different colors to represent different types of boundaries, and when you zoom into California, it's going to have you look at the big fault that we have here in California. You'll continue to work through those steps. Steps 4, and then you'll continue on the next page, answer additional questions like what type of tectonic plate boundary is found in the Gulf of California, apply what you've learned. Do you think that Baja was once attached to the mainland of Mexico? Why or why not, based on the drawings and interpretations that you've made off of that website. Moving on to step 5, 6, and 7, it's having you look at different places and looking at specific earthquakes of magnitude 5.8 or greater. And then once you've selected that, it's going to have you describe the patterns in which you observe on that map. Then moving forward through these additional steps, you move into step 9, which has you look at absolute plate motions, which is showing the distance in millimeters that each plate moves per year. We know on average they move about the same rate in which your fingernails grow, about 2.54 centimeters or 1 inch a year. But that's on average. Some move more, some move less. So you're going to be able to look at those genuine and authentic measurements to make observations and interpretations of those motions and directions. So then you continue to work through that. Moving into step 14 and 15, you're going to look at years and sort both ascending and descending types of earthquakes and patterns. So as you continue to walk through this, I'm going to leave you with that because I know it's a lot. You move into step 21. So now we're going to be able to analyze the locations of the deepest earthquakes. So as you work through all those additional steps, it's going to have you answer questions and pull screens and zoom in, zoom out, observe this, draw that, and then you get into this where it's okay, now we're looking at the big picture. Explain the location of the deepest earthquakes based on the plate tectonic boundary type. Include a labeled cross-section of that boundary type. So it's asking you to first locate the deepest earthquakes, what plate tectonic boundary is it, and to draw it. Step 22 is to have us fill in this little table. It says, uncheck the South American quake boxes and zoom out so the whole world is back in view. Zoom in on each mountain range and identify the plate tectonic boundary type. So you're going to find, as an example, the first one, the Andes, is done for you. Where is it? It's on South America. What boundary type is it? It's ocean to continental convergence. So you're going to be able to look at all these other mountain ranges, identify what continent that mountain range is on, and what type of boundary is creating that mountain range itself. Once you do that, it says along with earthquake activity and the locations of mountain ranges, we can also explain locations of volcanoes. So we're going to be able to use a different website, scan the QR code, click the link, and this is going to part of ESRI, ESRI, which is part of the GIS programs, to look at plate type effects on volcanoes. So step 2, on the panel to the left of the map, there's an option that says show contents of map. Hover your mouse over the icon to find it and then click the icon to show the contents of the map. Again, it's going to work you through some additional steps that's going to have you look at global volcanoes, then looking at, away from global volcanoes, we'll move into, zoom into California, describe the locations of the plate tectonic boundaries found in California, which moves us into step 8. So zoom out so that you can see all the Pacific West Coast from Washington to California. What plate boundary type caused the Pacific Northwest volcanoes? So again, these diagrams are all going to be observed in that program as you're working through it. Then you're going to zoom out and you're going to end with both Alaska and Hawaii and talking about those volcanic arcs as well. And that will actually wrap up your Part C. So again, we've used the majority of Part C is to look at these applications, which is way more efficient than just looking at textbooks. Look at these locations, zoom around, research big earthquakes, deep earthquakes, looking at clusters and where they might be and why they might be, and then looking at correlations and relationships of plate boundaries, specific plate boundaries, and the creation of volcanoes. So I hope that was helpful, and let's start the next part. All right, Part D. Hotspots. Now, while the majority of earthquake and volcanic activity is found along tectonic plate boundaries, some can occur along what are known as hotspots. So this portion of the lab is going to introduce what hotspots are, how they are fueled, how they operate, and then what is the resulting piece. I'll give you a hint. If you notice in the figure down below, figure 13.6, looking at hotspot volcano formation over time, this is essentially what we observe in Hawaii with the development of a hotspot volcanic system that continues to make anew, and then as time progresses, what's interesting about this whole system is that you have a hotspot. My hand represents the plate. My finger is the hotspot. The hotspot's stationary, so it makes a new volcano. But the plate is also in motion, so I make a new volcano, and then the plate moves and makes a new volcano, and makes a new volcano, and a new volcano as that plate continues to move, which means you leave the older volcanoes behind in a sense. So you're going to learn about how that works and operates, which brings us into this wonderful diagram here, the plate tectonic map with selected prominent hotspots. So this map, figure 13.7, is really showing, again, plate boundaries, and then showing these locations of very prominent hotspots. One that really speaks to me when just looking is almost smack dab in the middle is Yellowstone National Park, which is home to a super volcano, which is one of the largest type of volcanoes in the world. In fact, the last eruption, which was some 164,000 years ago, was so massive and it put so much debris in the atmosphere, it caused a global cooling by 2 degrees because it put so much particulate matter in the atmosphere that it prevented the sunlight from actually shining through and heating the Earth's surface. So nonetheless, you're going to be able to interpret this map looking at the explanation or the legend on the left, talking about divergent boundaries, convergent, transform, the boundary zones, and then the prominent hotspots. And question 33 asks you to observe, interpret, and then reflect on what you learn in that image. So how many hotspots are located within the Pacific Ocean? What is the name of the hotspot found on the continental North American plate? So you're going to continue to answer those questions based on that diagram. Now, the next diagram, 13.8 on the following page, shows the age of the seafloor on the Pacific plate. So let me just go down here. Now, what's interesting about this diagram is that it's showing that the Hawaiian Islands, North American continent, the Aleutian Islands, great. So what we're observing here is the age of the crust. So we can see there's a color spectrum. So the closer to the brown that you are located, you're going to find that that is going to be the youngest crust. As you get farther away towards the blue, that's going to be older. So you see it's based on the age of ocean floor in millions of years. So what you're able to observe here as well is looking at the seamounts that have been identified. So as an example, question 34A says, what is the age of the range of the seafloor where the emperor seamounts are located, which are found up here. So my mouse. So we notice that this material, this oceanic crust, is newer, and as we move towards the left it becomes older, which is implying in a sense that the material is moving to the left, right? It's moving westward, but at different rates, because we can see it's not an even transition all the way across. So anyway, nonetheless, you're going to work through question 34, which is having you interpret this diagram. Then using your answers from questions A and B above and the understanding of hotspots, in 1 or 2 sentences explain how the emperor's seamounts were formed. And then question D says the Midway Islands are approximately 2,400 kilometers from the Hawaiian Islands. If the Pacific plate moves at an average rate of 85 millimeters per year, how long do you think it would take for the Hawaiian Islands to move where the Midway Islands are located today? Tip: first, convert kilometers into millimeters by multiplying it by 1,000,000. Second, divide that number by 85. Be sure to show your work. Now, once you complete that, which is a little math, and I have confidence that you'll be able to get through it, it's asking you for this last part to just look at Yellowstone hotspot, something that maybe you haven't heard of before. Maybe you visited and seen those geothermal hot springs and the geysers. So go ahead and scan that QR code, hit that hyperlink to learn a little bit more about the Yellowstone hotspot itself. That being said, we wrapped up part C. No, we didn't. Part D. All right, welcome to part E. It says plate tectonic synthesis. So this is really the big putting it together moment. So it says review the above information on the Earth's interior, plate tectonic boundaries, and hotspots in order to answer the following questions. Question 35. Why is it necessary to understand the layers of the Earth's interior in order to understand plate tectonic boundary types and hotspots? Explain your response in at least 3 college-level sentences. Then moving forward, question 36 says, students often confuse the three plate tectonic boundary types, convergent, divergent, and transform, as well as hotspots. What are the similarities and the differences associated with them? And also to take into consideration which boundaries are associated with mountain building, volcanoes, and earthquakes. Please, again, respond with at least 3 college-level sentences. Then we move into figure 13.2, which is question number 37. Now, it says, refer to figures 13.1 and 13.5 earlier in the lab and or your labeled appendix. Complete table 13.2 with examples of each of the plate features. For the column on the right, name a specific geographic location. As an example, the Nazca plate, South American plate boundary, or maybe even the Galapagos location. So what you're looking at is, it says, where is an ocean-to-ocean convergent plate boundary? Give a geographic example there. So again, you can use these here, or it says you can use the appendix 13.1, which is this last page here, and that becomes of more help. But between all those images, you should be able to find and locate a geographic example of each one of these. Again, an oceanic hotspot, a continental hotspot, so on and so forth. And then question 38, which is the final question of this lab, says, why do you think plate tectonic theory is called the unifying theory of all geology? Explain your response in 1 to 2 sentences. Plate tectonics is really the foundation of our understanding, because once we learned and understood how plate tectonics operated, how it maneuvered, where it's going, and where it came from, we were able to look at geologic history as well, and we're able to understand, well, why is the fossil record split amongst continents that are thousands of miles apart? And it was enabling us to learn that at some point they weren't thousands of miles apart, that they would have been a lot closer. If you have any questions, be sure to comment below. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe. And that being said, we'll talk soon on the next lab.